with the firm Moran Global Strategies. I represent a number of international clients on the African continent. One of the clients that I represent, which we'll discuss more, is the Biafra Public Government in Exile, which is the political arm of the Biafra independence movement. And in that capacity, I've played an active role in shaping U.S.-Nigeria policy, including the current posture coming out of Washington, taking a very harsh stance against the government of Nigeria for a number of issues, including the Christian genocide.
Because you're making it very clear that you have a client, therefore I don't expect you to be very objective. I expect you to be subjective and defending the interests of your clients on this conversation. Am I right?
That's correct. I'm very open about who I represent. It's public information. And I think as a point of ethics, if people were to represent certain interests, they should make that clear when asked questions about those interests. So I think I have an obligation to tell the audience exactly how I'm involved with this, because I'm not simply a neutral outside observer. I'm active in shaping U.S.-Nigeria policy on behalf of certain interests, and I think I have a moral and ethical obligation to make that clear to you and the audience, and look forward to having a further discussion. And even though I do come with a certain perspective, I will make sure to separate whatever my personal opinions are from clearly established facts.
Thank you. I would like us to start the conversation by looking at the recent President Trump designation of the problems in Nigeria. He said there's a Christian genocide in Nigeria. Why would he call this a Christian genocide? I know you advocate or you represent the Biafran movement, but is what is happening in Nigeria a Christian genocide or banditry, criminality that affects everybody?
Yes, I think the reason why we are using, or the U.S. government's using the term Christian genocide, is you're not simply talking about general criminality. When it comes to groups like Boko Haram, ISWAP, and other groups that are engaging in mass murder, there is a religious undertone to these actions. Their actions are targeted against Christians. Yes, there also have been other individuals who've been murdered as well, moderate Muslims and so forth. But there's a clear religious undertone in terms of the targeted killings that are being taken place. And genocide is as much about intent as it is about the number of people who are killed, which in this case is quite significant. So this is not simply a matter of general criminality like in other contexts. There are religious and other motivations in the context of the killings that are happening, the groups that are behind it, and ultimately the complicity of the government of Nigeria as well in terms of the insecurity in the country.
Yeah, when you mention Boko Haram, ISWAP, ISIS, what comes to mind is terrorism. How could terrorism be linked to genocide? These are therefore terrorists who are committing terrorist acts, and then you refer to it as a genocide against Christians. That doesn't seem to match with my understanding.
I think you bring up a very good point. I think part of the problem is that the Nigerian government is not an innocent bystander in this. If it were, then maybe a term other than genocide would be used. But the problem is that the government of Nigeria is complicit in what is happening, and you have elements of the government of Nigeria that are tied to these terrorist groups. So if we look at the current government of Nigeria, the vice president of the country currently, Shettima, has deep ties to Boko Haram. Some have called him the co-founder of Boko Haram. But regardless, everyone, and this is a public fact in Nigeria, he has deep ties to this terrorist group. There are photos that are available. Politicians in Nigeria have talked about this. What I'm saying is not a speculation. It's an established fact in terms of his ties. You have elements of the Nigerian military that also have ties to the same terrorist groups. And there have been famous instances of this. For example, back in 2014, there were plans between the U.S. and the Nigerians to rescue the Chibok schoolgirls. And one of the plans was foiled because elements of the Nigerian military leaked the planned operations to the terrorist groups. So the reason why the term genocide or you've also heard the term Christian persecution is being used, is that you also have complicity of elements. I'm not saying the entire Nigerian government, but at least elements of the Nigerian government that are sympathetic to these same terrorist groups or who have relations with the same terrorist groups. And I think that's a fundamental part of the problem. And in a way, it's almost, to use an American phrase, asking the wolf to guard the sheep, or to ask the fox to guard the hen house. Because how can we hope that a government could effectively fight the same terrorist groups in which some extremely senior members of that government have relations with those groups? And again, even politicians in Nigeria have openly talked about, we have this dangerous situation in which elements of our own government are tied to terrorist groups. So this is not just Elias's opinion. So
Let's look at it this way. The United States has legal instruments like the Magnitsky Act and other sanctions that they could apply to the individuals you have identified and mentioned, if at all they are guilty of what you are mentioning. Why doesn't the Nigerian government or the United States government use those tools at their disposal to target the individuals they know are directly linked to Boko Haram, instead of categorizing a whole nation as suffering from genocide, understanding that maybe the vice president, as you say, is part of it, but then the president himself, who is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, is not part of it? Is that not a mistake on the side of the United States?
I don't think it's a mistake, and also I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. So you talk about targeted sanctions. That's the next step. President Trump has designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern, which is an appropriate designation, given their poor record on religious freedom. But additional steps need to be made. Simply designating the Nigerian government as a country of particular concern is not sufficient. There have been talks and efforts in the U.S. Congress to go further than what the president has done, and to start engaging in targeted sanctions on specific Nigerian officials. And Magnitsky sanctions are an enormously effective tool to be used as almost a surgical knife to identify specific wrongdoers who are engaging in bad acts and are of a malignant influence. I think the U.S. government, people like Senator Ted Cruz, who we've met with, has publicly talked about how he knows who the guilty parties are. There are lists that are being considered now in Washington. Names are being discussed. These things aren't overnight. They take time. I will anticipate over the coming months that there will be a push for certain Nigerian officials to be sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act that you referenced. So, you actually mentioned something that we completely agree with, and I think you'll see as one of the next steps. And the great thing about the Magnitsky Act is, again, these are targeted sanctions that specifically go after the wrongdoers, rather than having something that's just generalized. So, targeted sanctions are effective, and those actions will be pursued.
I understand that is just a first step, and there could be second steps or third steps. But President Hegseth to prepare to attack Nigeria, meaning he understands, or they already know where the terrorists are, and they could just go there and obliterate them, as he did with the nuclear arsenals in Iran. So why take all these steps if he already knows that is where the problem is and the terrorists could be obliterated?
Right. Those are two things, right? One is a symptom of the problem, which can be addressed through military action, right? Eliminating specific terrorists. But the problem will continue if the government of Nigeria continues to have politicians that have relations with these terrorists that covertly support these terrorist groups. So there can be operations that are done to eliminate terrorists, terrorist cells, and terrorist operators in Nigeria. But ultimately, we also need to engage on it using the diplomatic tools. It's not enough to use military tools. You have to use diplomatic tools in order to...
But you use military tools after diplomatic tools have failed. But President Trump started with military tools.
Well, as you can see, we haven't engaged. The U.S. government yet is considering its options, right? There haven't been military operations, full-scale military operations yet. And the President Trump has a very unique style, if you will. in terms of dealing. That's very unique, right, amongst the presidents that we've had. And I think that in dealing with a country like Nigeria, where people have for years been complaining about these issues, and the government of Nigeria has refused to listen to the suffering of its own people, I think, frankly, a straightforward style of the president is what's needed in order to show the government of Nigeria that we're serious, and that they can't continue with what they've been doing. And you can see that the president's style has caused the Nigerian government to have a reaction, whereas for years they've just been completely blasé. And a lot of my friends in Africa very much like the president's straightforward, no-nonsense style. And I think when you're dealing with a country like Nigeria or some of these other countries where you have bad governments, diplomatic whispers often don't move the needle. You need to be a little bit more aggressive. So I think it's part of the president's diplomatic style of carrying a big stick. And I think sometimes that's what's needed. And I think it's been effective in this case.
I think President Trump's direct style, where he breaches diplomatic protocols, is one of the strategies that he uses to get things going and resolving problems around the world. But let's come back to talk about the funders of the Boko Haram. You have been emphatic that military officers in Nigeria and politicians are part of that movement. But we have on record on the floor of Congress, a congressman reading an audit of USAID. And in it, he claims that the USAID has been sponsoring Boko Haram. So why is President Trump putting the responsibility on Nigerians and Nigerian leaders, while there is evidence from the United States side, read by a congressman on the floor of Congress, that the USAID has been participating in this? Why is the responsibility falling only on Nigerians now?
Well, the responsibilities, as discussed, are falling not on Nigerians, not the Nigerian people, but these horrible, horrific Nigerian politicians. And I want
to make on the United States side, there seems to have been action sponsoring that too.
Yeah, well, and you see what President Trump did on that front. President Trump has shut down USAID and has folded USAID into the State Department, and a lot of ineffective programs were eliminated. Again, I'm not, I try to work to influence U.S. policy in directions in which I think they are the right directions. That doesn't mean that everything the U.S. government has done has been correct. Sometimes mistakes have been made. And I think the president made the right choice in terms of deciding to make reforms within our administrative state. So again, the same USAID that you're mentioning that the congressman talked about is the same USAID that the president has shut down, and it's now been folded in the State Department. Programs like that, those programs have been closed. And there have been other programs too that have made absolutely no sense whatsoever. We've unfortunately, USAID, which had started with good intentions, had a variety of programs that just didn't make any sense, that were a waste of taxpayer money, sometimes even working against our interests. So I think that that's a perfect example in terms of why there have been reforms. But nonetheless, the primary responsibility is for the problems in Nigeria is the government of Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make a clarification here. You work with the of how State Department and the government of the United States is operating, and the processes, how you read them from outside. Am I being right?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm a lobbyist, government relations consultant here in Washington, D.C., so I'm not an employee or representative of the U.S. government. That being said, I work closely with all the parts of the U.S. government, including our Congress, State Department, White House, National Security Council, and other agencies. So I'm not a representative of the State Department. I'm not a formal representative of the U.S. government, but these are all officials whom I talk to, who I work closely with, who I try to bring my information to and my perspective. So I hope that provides a clarification.
Of the genocide. In his testimony to the Subcommittee on Africa in Congress recently, Ambassador Jonathan Pratt said, Northern Nigeria faces a constant threat from these terrorist organizations, compounding this unacceptable level of violence against vulnerable Christian communities. Nigeria continues to prosecute blasphemy cases, which my colleague will discuss in more detail. This claim of genocide against Christians and Christian persecution, is that based on what is happening to Christians only in the north of Nigeria or everywhere across Nigeria?
Yeah, this is a broader issue, and let's bring this beyond the issue of simply terrorism. I think some context is needed here. Nigeria is almost evenly split between Christian and Muslim. For a period of a few decades, there was an attempt to have a balance of power in the country where there was, you could say, an informal understanding that there should be a rotation between Christian and Muslim presidents and vice presidents, and that the government should be secular. And there was a very fragile balance of power. And that balance of power was upset in 2015 with the rise to power of the former military dictator of Nigeria, Buhari, as president. And he began the process of introducing Islamic fundamentalism into the government, engaging, that's when you started to have the increased persecution of the Biafrans and the Biafran independence movement. That you start to have policies about reintegration of quote unquote repentant terrorists into the Nigerian military, and this process of fundamentalism coming into the government has continued. Whereupon now in the current government, I talked about Shettima, but you have in both President Tinubu and Shettima for really the first time a Muslim ticket, where you don't have Christians in either the presidency or the vice presidency. You also have the spread of Sharia law in the north of the country, and now there are attempts to bring that southwards. So, for example, there have been attempts to now introduce Sharia law into parts of the southwest of the country, what we call Yoruba land, for example, right? And the Yorubas tend to be more religiously moderate, but now they're trying to bring Sharia law into the middle belt, even south into the country. Some of these radical politicians are trying to make these sorts of proposals. You also have, again, the terrorists, Fulani herders coming from the north into the middle belt, and even now parts of both the southwest and the southeast, what we call Biafra land. So there's considerable concern by many elements of the country, actually, that you have basically a fundamentalist capture of the key institutions of government in the government and the military. And it's something that is deeply concerning to people. So I think that's a very important factor as well. That's also, of course, connected to this issue of terrorism as well. So that's just another factor that is deeply concerning, I think, to both Biafrans and Nigerians generally, as well as to the US government, frankly.
I get you very well. What difference do you make between the Fulani herders and the Boko Haram terrorists? Because when I listen to you, it looks like the two are the same.
No, I didn't say the two are the same. I'm saying there have been issues by those groups and other groups in terms of murders of innocent civilians, and the situation has gone completely out of hand in the country. So I did not, I didn't say all these groups are the same. They have different nuances, but they all contribute to the problem.
So at what time, I am asking these questions because I understand that your work informs the United States government on what is happening in Nigeria. So at what point do you make a difference between a Fulani herder attack on farmers and a Boko Haram attack on farmers or on Christians? How do you make that difference?
I'm not sure if I really understand the question. I think it's almost, splitting hairs in terms of if the government of Nigeria is not only not protecting the country, but you have politicians that are tied to radical groups that are killing innocent civilians, whether or not an innocent person is murdered by Fulani herders or by Boko Haram. I think it's a problem either way. So I'm not sure if I understand what kind of
point. I get the point where you are making the argument that it doesn't matter whether it is called a genocide or it's called Christian persecution. What matters is insecurity, and the government of Nigeria is not performing its role.
And that's where many people are offended by because they try to engage in semantics and there is no genocide and maybe use this other term. And even if you see the reactions, forget about the US government, if you see the reactions of many Nigerians, they themselves get furious when they see these Nigerian media spokespeople trying to, split hairs over definitions and terms. And you'll hear many regular, not just Biafrans, but Nigerians generally, say, hey, listen, the country is a disaster. We're moving towards a failed state. We have problems. People are being killed, and yet you're trying to, make a debate over terminology. So, I think this is something where, even people in Nigeria are very, very upset, and they want their own government to be held accountable for what's happening.
Okay, so I'm happy with that clarification. So at this point, from your understanding of what the United States Congress and White House and State Department are thinking, what would be a solution that the United States would say, okay, the Nigerian government is doing everything now to protect Christians? What is going to happen for them to say that that is happening?
Yeah, I think when you're dealing, again, with the country in Nigeria, with the types of people that are running the government, the best tool to use is really sanctions, including targeted sanctions. When these corrupt Nigerian politicians, for example, are no longer able to, let's say, launder their money in the US and other places, if, let's say, their assets are seized, because also many of these officials are completely corrupt in outrageous ways. And there have been a number of stories about the corruption of Nigerian officials. So if we were to go after officials who are complicit, who are part of the problem, sanctioning them and holding them accountable, I think that would be the best way to change their behavior. Simply trying to nicely ask the Nigerian government officials, oh, please do something. People have been asking the Nigerian government to do something for years. Clearly, they've not cared to do anything, and the problem's only gotten worse. So I think when you're dealing with a conundrum like Nigeria or any other, and these other governments too, I think, a tough approach is what's needed, frankly. And the same goes to, for other governments in Africa as well, where, let's say, especially with more autocratic regimes. But, that's a separate discussion.
Yes, we're going to talk about that in a moment. I want us to switch gears now and talk about Biafra. So we'll definitely talk about autocratic governments like the government of Cameroon when we talk about Biafra in this case. In an article by the Africa Report, they say former U.S. Congressman Jim Moran, who lent a voice to the indigenous people of Biafra movement in 2024, the situation in Nigeria reflects human rights abuses, religious freedom issues, persecution of Christians, increasing Islamic fundamentalism with the Nigerian government and its alignment with U.S. adversaries. But in his statement, Ambassador Jonathan Pratt says, Nigeria is one of the United States' key allies in Africa. Is your firm having this thing wrong?
No, I think not at all. I think one thing to clarify is the U.S. government is a very complex machinery. It works in a very unique way. On any particular issue, you'll have different parts of the U.S. government that may have different points of view, right? What matters is what's the overall political consensus among those who are the decision makers. In this case, when it comes to taking a strong stance against the government of Nigeria, you see extremely strong support in the United States Congress. I've worked with many of these members of Congress. That's now been reflected at the White House and in the National Security Council and the President of the United States himself. And ultimately, in the nature of the current U.S. government, what really matters is the policy stance of President Trump. The viewpoint of the president is reflective in U.S. government policy. This is different than, let's say, other administrations where decisions are made at a more bureaucratic level through the interagency process. In this case, what the U.S. government policy is the viewpoint of President Trump. The State Department tends to be a little bit more, how shall we say, conservative and risk averse usually. So that's why you have people like Ambassador Pratt making those comments, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the overall consensus and the viewpoint of the people or the decision makers. Mind you, before this whole topic took off the past 2-3 months in terms of Christian genocide and the stance of the President of the United States, you had people like Masad Boulos, who's another senior State Department official, who try to argue that the Christians aren't being targeted and that maybe more Muslims are being killed. Mr. Boulos has had a past history with Nigeria, given his background, and has friendly relations with the president of Nigeria. But then the president of the United States decided to take a different stance, given the government. I guess what I'm trying to say is the stance of the U.S. government is very clear through the opinion of the president of the United States. President Trump has even made comments saying Niger disgrace. So with due respect, what really matters is the viewpoint of President Trump, his influential people in the White House, and his allies in the U.S. Congress. And Ambassador Pratt, I think, is speaking in diplomatic terminology, but that's not really.
Yeah, that background was necessary. And somebody who's listening to us now, it's definitely asking, how did you get to President Trump's ears, whereas his own ambassador could not convince him on these issues?
Well, that's why lobbying is important here in Washington, D.C. It's to engage in an education campaign. For the past year, we've been very proactively lobbying members of the U.S. Congress, educating them on these issues, building alliances. And again, we can't take all the credit. You've also had some pro-Christian evangelical groups that were very active and also lobbying on behalf of similar issues, Christian persecution in Nigeria. And some of those groups we've allied and worked with and cooperated with in terms of our lobbying efforts. And because of the alliances we built in the U.S. Congress, and you had people like Senator Ted Cruz, who are extremely influential, who introduced legislation calling for sanctions on Nigeria, that penetrated into the White House, into places like the National Security Council, which is very influential in this particular White House. And eventually that percolated to the president, and the president decided to take action on the issue. So lobbying is systematic. You build alliances, and if you build enough alliances with influential members of Congress and other individuals who speak directly to the president, that can influence the viewpoint of the president of the United States. And also, too, I think this was very natural for the president because many of his supporters are people who are evangelicals or pro-Christian and so forth. So I think this was a very natural decision for him to make.
Am I understanding you very clear that in your lobbying and advocacy, you have decided to use Christians in place of Biafra in order to catch President Trump's attention?
Well, I won't say in place, but rather in connection with, because again, the Biafra issues both has ethnic undertones, but also it's there are religious connotations to it as well, because the Biafrans are predominantly Christian. And so we have advanced the Biafra issue in conjunction with the issue of Christian persecution in Nigeria, because those are connected issues and related issues. It's just the Biafra issue also has some specific nuances to it beyond also the Christian issue as well.
So you're saying that you added Biafra and Christian advocacy to catch President Trump's attention. Am I getting that clear?
That's correct. And again, those are related issues. It's just that the Biafra matter also has some additional elements and nuances to it.
What are those additional elements and nuances?
Well, when it comes to the persecution Biafrans have faced, part of it, there is a religious element to it because the Biafrans are a significant bulk of the Christian population of the country. But there's also an ethnic element because Biafrans, one of the major tribes in Biafra land are the Igbo people who've suffered significant persecution in Nigeria in the 1960s. Of course, you're aware that there was a civil war where the Biafrans tried to establish their independence, and they had their own state for 3 years, recognized by some countries. Unfortunately, they were re-annexed by Nigeria, and unfortunately, they were never really fully accepted back into society. They face discrimination and marginalization since the end of the Civil War. They haven't been able to get, for example, the Nigerian presidency. And there's, for example, a lot of that part of the country, Southeast Nigeria, the Nigerian government has purposely neglected to invest in that area, develop the infrastructure of that area. You have Port Harcourt, for example, that's still been completely undeveloped. This is all intentional to punish the people of what we call the Southeast Nigeria, or Biafra. So there's been very unnecessary persecution and marginalization, which has only gotten worse with the recent governments in Nigeria, and this is something that needs to be
I hear all those points, but one point came to mind, or one point struck me more. Did you say Nigeria re-annexed Biafra?
What I was trying to get at is, after the Biafrans declared independence in 1967, there's a 3-year civil war, and then Nigeria unfortunately won the civil war. That's what I was trying to convey.
Okay, so Nigeria won the civil war, and Biafra became reintegrated into.
That's what I was saying. Yes.
So what is the basis for the Biafran movement of independence right now? Is it a historical base or an economic?
I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I think a fundamental part of the problem is Nigeria is really an artificial amalgamation of the British, where they put together disparate peoples and under colonial borders. In 1914, you have the Biafrans in the southeast, you have the Yorubas in the southwest, and then you have the Hausas and Fulanis in the north. Unfortunately, the British played some games where they favored politicians in the north, which they felt could be more easily controlled, and empowered the northern politicians for political power in Nigeria, even though you have the human capital and the economic resource space in the south of the country. The Biafrans or Igbo people are incredibly educated, entrepreneurial, and also the Yorubas in the southwest. You have Lagos. They're also very educated. A lot of the Nigerian professors that you see are of Yoruba background, for example. And also that's where you have considerable natural resources, and let's say in the Biafra territory in terms of oil and gas and so forth, which unfortunately they don't get the benefit of that. So the country was put together. And again, when there was an attempt of having a balance of power between Christian and Muslim presidents and vice presidents, the country was kind of barely holding together in this dysfunctional way. But now that the balance has been upset, the country's totally spiraling into a failed state, because ultimately you have different competing value systems, within the same country. You have parts of the north, again, that are under Sharia law. You have, again, the Biafrans who are completely different in terms of being westward oriented, Christian, highly educated population. So the whole system is disintegrating. And we've seen this in this happen in other cases, in other contexts, like, for example, the breakup of Yugoslavia and so forth. So, unfortunately, we're at a situation now where, given just how dysfunctional the country is, other options have to be considered. And what I'm talking about is not radical. Many people throughout Nigeria have talked about we have to really reconsider this whole arrangement. Even people in the Southwest, the Yorubas, some of them have called for their independence because they're just concerned that the whole system is becoming dysfunctional and collapsing. So given the state of that country and just how dysfunctional it is and how the system is at odds with itself, I think a lot of people are saying, okay, this is the time to sit back and potentially rethink how Nigeria should work, and if parts of the country should have, let's say, greater autonomy or even their own independence. So this is not a radical point of view, and this is not just a perspective of the Biafrans. Different people in different parts of what we call Nigeria are seriously reconsidering this entire arrangement.
So based on these factors you have just outlined, what is your client's final objective? Is it independence or greater autonomy within Nigeria?
Yeah, so the eventual goal is independence. But that being said, the Biafra government also is very sophisticated. They understand how international diplomacy is. That's why they're working closely through me with the U.S. government, and we're working on seeing how we can achieve the goal, because it's going to take some time, and there are going to have to be transitionary processes as well as we work towards the eventual goal of independence. The creation of entities that are autonomous or newly independent states. These are things that take time, and it's something we want to be very thoughtful about. So the Biafra government, through my efforts here, is having close dialogue with the U.S. government And this is a process that we're working on, but it's going to take time. And we're making sure that we're working with the U.S. and other necessary stakeholders to work towards the eventual goal.
Let's talk again about the religious persecution and genocide as it's being presented. The Nigerian those claims and say that is reality. But when President Trump made his statement, mostly Biafran diaspora was celebrating and jubilating. Do you think the Biafran diaspora is considering this as a win for their advocacy?
The president's actions are absolutely a win. And again, what the government of Nigeria is talking about is just complete nonsense. I mean, we see this recently in the life sentence of Nnamdi Kanu, who's a prominent Biafran activist that was illegally kidnapped by the government of Nigeria in 2021 from Kenya. He's the Nelson Mandela of our time. He's been a peaceful activist for an independent Biafra. The government of Nigeria kidnaps that gentleman, drags out his trial for years, gives him a life sentence. Meanwhile, you have the president of Nigeria pardoning drug traffickers, murderers, and convicted Islamic terrorists. So a lot of not just Biafrans, but even other Nigerians, when they look